So here you can see the city of Merida, and Merida was much smaller a few years ago. It was only 1 million people, and within the last 8 years it expanded to 2 million people. So you can see how the city is moving out, and so there's a lot of development in that area. But around the city there's still a fair bit of jungle around, and so a lot of that area is still in forest, but a lot of that area has been degraded. A lot of the large trees have been cut out and sold off, and so a lot of this forest that is remaining is similar to the stuff that we have at Earth Connection Center. So being a model for ecological restoration at the center is really important, and showing other people how to do the ecological restoration to restore these areas back into health is really important. So here you can see the Earth Connection Center, and then you can kind of see the dividing line between our property and the neighbor's property, which is a ranch. So on this side the area is fairly denuded, and because the cows have taken off most of the vegetation, it's been left alone for a little bit of time, and so some of the grass has started to come back, but they would regularly go in there and cut down the larger trees so that the grass would grow more effectively, because they wanted that grass biomass for the cows. So you can see the difference between our side of the fence, and this is looking into the other side of the fence, where our trees have started to grow up, so there are a lot more trees and it's filled in a lot more. And so looking from the Earth Connection Center property and looking out, you can see that there's a lot lower trees, more shrubby trees, more open areas, and more grass. So this is the difference between the areas that we're having. So this is kind of like the area when we first started. It was very denuded. The cows had taken off most of the vegetation, and the farmers had kept it fairly open. And so this is what we were originally working with at Earth Connection Center, and it's an opportunity for restoration. So this is a parcel of land that's adjacent to our property, and you can see a little bit of the difference between one property and the next. This is the fence line that joins the two, and on this side they cut most of the trees so that the grass would grow and that the pasture would establish themselves. The cows have been removed for a number of months now, so the grass has started to grow up and fill in on the layer. But you can see across the other side here that the vegetation is less grass on the ground and more trees. So our side is filling in a little bit more. It's getting a little bit greener over there. So that hasn't been touched very much. We mostly let it naturalize on the front half of the property. And so this is a large area, and he had some problems with his cows, and so he's basically sold off his cows at this point. So our restoration project has an opportunity that we can talk to our neighbor and create some sort of a discourse about restoring this part of the property to something similar to what we have on the other side, and possibly doing ecotourism, different things like that. So it's an opportunity to start doing some restoration work on this side of the fence. And the way our property is, it's kind of an isolated strip. So working with the community, working with our neighbors, and trying to expand that out is kind of scaling up the project. And so this has been, for this area of ranch has been out of production for not very long. And so some of the shrubs have started to come up, some of the thorny shrubs, and it was something like what our property was originally. So this property is probably about 13 hectares. So making this an additional part of our property, and then talking to different neighbors, getting community involvement, and expanding the reserve that we're creating out further and further, so that it creates more habitat for different wildlife. And trying to generate some sort of an income so that the people that are here that have lost their income from the cows can find a different form of income, maybe through ecotourism or through giving talks at our center, different things like that. Getting people involved more in the community is really important for doing that. So this area of Mexico is very rich in biodiversity. On the aquatic ponds that we've created on the property, we're getting like 50 different species every day coming to those ponds. And the difference between this property and our property is that we have water available for the wildlife. You can hear the difference. It's very quiet here. There's not a lot of wildlife on this side of the fence versus our side of the fence, where we're constantly getting different animals coming to drink water on our property, and we have more diversity on our property. So just, you can hear the difference. But this is a really important biologically diverse area. It's an important flyway from the north going through the Yucatan and moving further south into South America. We're getting a lot of birds that are coming from northern areas and then they're overwintering here. So it's important to have this habitat here. Mexico is the fourth most biodiverse country in the world. So expanding out this project is really important. So what are some of the steps that we need to consider when we're doing this? Well, one of the first things we did, because when we first came to the property, the ground was completely denuded by the cows, and you can see it's already started that process of recovery, but the grass has started to grow again. A few shrubs and trees that were constantly being eaten by the cows are starting to shoot up again. But fencing out the cows from other properties that wander around is a really important step in terms of recovery. So protecting the site and protecting the trees that are starting to develop, so that if a cow wanders into this area, that the area is protected and the trees are allowed to reestablish themselves. Because we've had different times where we've had cows come into the property, and you have a nice tree like this, the next day it'll be down to the ground because they've broken it off and they've chomped off all the leaves. So they have a major impact on this area, and the cows here really aren't that healthy because there really isn't a lot of biomass production in the same way as in other areas, because it's very rocky, the soil. You can see here the rocks are very close to the surface. There's not a lot of organic matter in the soil, especially since the cows have been eating everything, and they eat everything that they can, especially on a small property like this. You put 20 cows on it, and basically they consume everything, especially in the dry season. In the wet season, they're not too bad, but in the dry season, for 6 months of the year, they have a really hard time. So just looking at the soil, you can see there's not a lot of organic matter in there. It's a little bit red, and so it needs to have some time for that soil to start to recover, so that if you're thinking about planting or seeding into this area, you need to think about how you can recover that soil. They do have water here, but most of the water is below the surface in the groundwater, so at the same level as the cenote that we have on our property. It's probably 10-15 meters down the water. So the wildlife here doesn't have an open cenote, and they don't have ponds available to them, so you're less likely going to have them on the property. So creating things like aquatic ponds. This is an old cattle feeding thing, cattle watering trough, and so just placing things like that around will help enhance the biodiversity of this area and attract more wildlife into the area. Obviously this is a little too tall for most wildlife. It's designed for cows, so you need to design something that's lower so most creatures can get in there and get out again. So one of the first things you do is checking out what sort of species are on the property. Here we have what's called a chimay. So it's a thorny tree. It's very short-lived, and on our property they've gone through the 15-year cycle for them, and they've already started to die. Whereas these ones, they're still growing, but a lot of them are also reaching the end of their cycle. They've died. And so there needs to be other species put in here besides the thorny species. There's a lot of nitrogen fixers here, so they're good because the soil is poor. They're fixing nitrogen and putting nitrogen back into the soil. And just incorporating more species into this property, because the cows have really reduced the diversity on the site. They're only allowing certain species that can tolerate their level of disturbance. Some trees like this, you know, you can see they've been knocked back many times, and then they've regrown from sprouts in the stem. So they're not that healthy, and the tree that's going to come out of that is going to be fairly weak because it's been chopped at so many times. So just looking around, there's things like cactuses, and there's all sorts of different species that are adapted to the very dry conditions. And so thinking about what species are here, you go around, and usually what I do is I'll make a list. I'll walk around the property and I'll go, okay, here's a cactus, this is the species, and if I don't know the name, then I go up to that particular species and I've got my camera. And so when you have your camera, you're taking detailed photos of what that particular species is about. There's not actually any flowers on it right now, which makes it a little more difficult to identify. The flowers are usually a main identification feature. So a lot of times you go multiple times a year so that you can capture the flowers as part of your biological inventory, so it's easier to identify. But then you want to make sure that you're collecting things like the full leaf when you're taking pictures, the stem, you know, what the base of the plant looks like. So all these different parts you want to take pictures of so that you can get a more accurate identification later on. And then when you write your notes, you write, okay, photo number 123 is cactus A. And then when you go home, you try to figure out, what is cactus A? Can I figure it out, or do I have to wait until it starts flowering and then I'll be able to identify it? And this is actually an edible plant in Mexico, the nopales, and this is a wild version, so it's not quite as tasty, but when it's young like this, a little bit younger than this, you can actually trim off all the thorns and you can actually eat it. And then when the flower blooms, the flower is edible, and then when the berry is formed later on that has all the seeds that you can collect and then propagate out, but you can also eat that berry. Eat the berry, eat the seeds, the fruit I mean, and then spit out the seeds and propagate the seeds. So it's all kind of a process. And naturally, of course, the birds, so you're trying to attract the birds in, and if you give them a water source, they're going to come here, take the fruit off of this cactus and spread it around the site. So it's thinking about how you can work with the natural environment rather than working against it, rather than bringing things in from far away and trying to adapt them to your site. Think about what species are actually here and how you can move them around, and how, because these are the species that are going to be the best adapted for restoring your site. And we have the advantage here because our property is right next to it. We've had some experience identifying the species, and we kind of know, okay, this is the species mosaic that's going to occur on this particular site. So we can use our site as a reference site. Even though it's degraded, it's already got eight years of restoration work and allowing it to renaturalize. And so you can mimic that mosaic, and you know which species are going to survive these harsh conditions, and you can transplant them over. We can collect seed from our property, grow the plants out and move them over, or just collect the seed and scatter the seed around and kickstart the process. So this is a pretty typical branch landscape, and some of the steps that you need to think about when you're doing your ecological restoration project is mapping out the areas, because there will be areas that have, you know, very low shrubs. Like this is an old field, so it's gradually starting to recover itself. So, but there will be other areas that'll have a little bit more of a forest pocket, other areas that'll have a bit deeper soil. You can see where an animal has dug up the soil and brought up the red soil here. But there's also areas, whole big areas, where there's either archaeological mounds, so there's mounds of rocks, or else it's just the parent material. There's huge areas of just rock. So you have to take in these things when you're doing your planning, and usually you go on to something like Google Map, or you can do some drone work, or the other aspect, once you've done that and you've kind of mapped out, okay, here's a different habitat, I want to take a look at that. Here's a rocky area, I want to take a look at that. So you're trying to map out on the entire property, where are these different habitats, where are these different conditions. Okay, maybe there's a bit deeper soil here. So just going around, and you do your initial computer assessment and an assessment of how this landscape is. You do things like talking to the neighbor. He owns the land, he's owned it for many, many years, so you can say, oh, there's this particular feature over here that I think is great, or there's this tree over there. And working with the neighbor to understand the property, and then yourself, you need to get out there and map it on the ground, take a look at these different individual spots, walk around with the neighbor, walk around with different people who have been associated. Maybe they're people who have worked on the farm, on this ranch before, and just walking around with them and getting a feel for the land and trying to understand what the land needs, and how things are distributed, how things are moving. You know, is there any sort of water movement on the property? Is there anywhere that's holding more water or more moisture? Is there some areas that are like super dry, and you have to think about, how can I hold more water on that particular area? You can think about things like, well, I see a lot of animal movements in a certain area, and maybe there's a small patch of taller trees. Maybe I can put some sort of a water feature there, because there's a lot of animals, and you can see the tracks moving through, different animal tracks and trails moving through the grass, and say, okay, here's a perfect spot for a water pond, and I'm going to put that there. And then you have to think about, well, how am I going to maintain that and keep it going through the whole process? And so initially you're just mapping and getting a feel for the property and trying to understand what's going on here. You know, what were the impacts? Obviously the cows were a major impact. Did they use any sort of chemicals with the cows? Did they spray the fields to control the woody vegetation? Did they seed in any species? Like, a lot of these grassy species may not actually be native here. It's like, okay, well, do I want these grassy species, or do I need to do some sort of a burn to control them, or to till it up so that you're controlling them before you start doing your project? So just walking around and trying to understand the lay of the land, and it's just basically understanding the energy of the land as well, and where the animals are, how they're moving, and just getting that general feel, because it's that feeling that gives you an idea of how to restore the property. There's kind of a technical knowledge that I've been giving you, but there's also this deeper knowledge that's kind of an art, where it moves beyond the head knowledge into just having a sense of where things should be and how things should develop over time. So that's something you need to get out and be in the field a lot, so that you start to develop that kind of a sense. And then you have to think about your initial monitoring. So you want to have some sort of a baseline monitoring, and so you're going in and you're inventorying all these different species and trying to understand what's actually here at the very beginning, so that when you start doing your restoration project, you know, these shrubby, thorny species, maybe they start disappearing at some point, and you want to be able to say, this is a change that I've caused in the habitat. And as the trees start to grow up, then it'll start shading out, and then it'll start changing the ecosystem. So you want to be able to monitor these different points. You don't have to do it every year, but something like every few years, every 5 years, you can come back, and then you'll see some significant changes usually in the landscape. So it's really important, especially if you're working with funders, or if you're working with the community. You need to be able to have this benchmark initially, so that you can tell them, these are the changes I've made. You know, there's been a shift in the community. There's been an increase in the amount of wildlife that's showing up on the property. You know, suddenly you're getting forest falcons and different things like that that are more associated with the forest interior. So you're showing that you're increasing the health of the forest, you're increasing the diversity and the species that are using it. And a lot of times people will choose like a target species, or I'm going for, you know, pandas, or we're going for jaguar, and I'm going to transform this. But a lot of times it's a lot more subtle than that. You know, suddenly there's a forest falcon that appears, and then it stays for a little while and goes away, but then a couple of years later it's nesting on your property, and then it's, you know, suddenly all your iguanas disappear, and and you go, what's going on? And suddenly you realize that that forest falcon's been hunting them and killing them and feeding them to its young. So these different things that are starting to happen, and it just starts to evolve, and it creates this kind of a synergy as things start to work together more and more, and the ecosystem starts to gel together. So initially in the planning phase, you're trying to figure that out. How is this going to happen? How are we going to move the succession process along? Are we going to actively restore this area? Or maybe we're fine with all these shrubby trees that are starting up. We'll allow them to grow up and die back, and then it'll slowly accumulate more carbon in the soil and increase the health of the forest on its own. You know, that'll take a much longer period of time, obviously. But then there's also just figuring out ways to kickstart the project. So how can I put certain species in certain areas where they're going to grow really well, and they're going to shift the ecosystem towards a more healthy state in a much quicker fashion. So if you're planning to just rewild the project, this ranch, then you can basically just leave it alone, and the successional processes will happen on its own. Obviously that's the cheapest way, but it's going to take more time. A lot of the first species that are coming in here are very thorny. This is what's been left by the cows. They're pioneer species. A lot of them are nitrogen fixers, but you do have good species such as this Tzitzilche here. You can see it's in seed, so you can collect the seed and move it around, but it's also an excellent species for bees, so you're attracting different pollinators. It produces a lot of nectar and produces a nice honey, so if you're trying to create some sort of an income off of the property, then maybe you want to encourage the spread of the Tzitzilche. But so these initial pioneers are kind of changing the ecosystem a little bit, moving it in the direction so that it sets up the right conditions for the next ecological succession process to happen. So as the soil organic matter increases, as the microbes in the soil increase, then it creates the right conditions for the next species to come in. But the alternative is, because we know that the cows have eaten most of the nice species out of here, and we've got all these very rough, tough species that are left, you may want to come in and put in the peach, the Guanacosta, the Ceiba, the Cedro, all these different things, the Salam, all these different species that are large trees that have big seed distributed by animals. You know, these animals aren't around here, and the trees are probably a good distance away, You can see mother trees in some of the Mayan villages, these great big trees, and they grow way up and they're really beautiful, but they're missing from this landscape. They should be here, and in a healthy forest ecosystem you'll see those species all here, but they're not going to magically appear unless you facilitate their movement into this area. So there's different strategies you need to consider when you're doing it. In terms of monitoring these areas, so you want to set up different things like, okay, I have, from our property we have lists. Okay, well, here's the plants in one data sheet, the trees in another data sheet, you know, something like the food forest and the vegetables that we're growing, that's on another sheet. And then the birds, the amphibians, the reptiles, the animals, the insects, you know, everything's got their own sheet. And I know I've been identifying the species as we come across them, and I put them into that sheet. And then across the top, just like our seed collection schedule, I have the dates, and it's like, okay, this is when I saw this bird, and okay, the rose-breasted grosbeak is coming in the middle of winter, and that's actually a boreal species up in Canada that migrates down. We see it for this period of time, and then it disappears. It goes back to Canada again. So just being able to mark those different trends through time is really important. And of course, some seeds are falling down from heaven as we're speaking. There's a nice tree behind us, a salam. And so the seeds are just falling down, and they're helping. All these seeds will help to restore this forest area. So this is what I'm talking about when you leave seed trees. You leave a few big seed trees in the area to help restore the forest back again. And you can see the tree back up in here, this guy up here, and you can see it's full of seed, but there's not very many big trees around. And then when you look at the ground, you can see how much seed is being dropped down onto the ground. So when you're kickstarting an ecosystem like this, they've left a few trees for the cows, but then you can see this is the plants, and each one of these is a seed. And so just leaving them on the ground, some of them will germinate, some of them will get eaten by animals, some of them will get moved by animals. But if you want to have the guanacosta in this area, you need to plant some guanacosta and then allow the natural distribution of the seed that will fall down, the animals will move them around, and so that you'll have some guanacosta in this planting area. So it's one of the considerations you need to think about. How do I get those species in here? How do I collect the seed? How do I germinate the seed? How do I, maybe start a little nursery so that I can grow the plants? Because a lot of these native species, especially in something like Mexico, they're just not as available. And in Mexico, this part of the Yucatan, there's 1,000 different tree species. So you're only going to be getting a small selection of that 1,000 species on this particular piece of land. And so if you want to increase the biodiversity, obviously you need to put more of that biodiversity back into the site. So, here's another one, another type of seed. You can just wander around and find these things. They're just part of the ecosystem. How do you find the seed? Finding the timing for those seeds on the different plants, because you want to grow them and you want to move them around and you want to encourage their development so you're getting more wildlife.
Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support keeps these videos free for everyone.